Well, good evening and welcome to Training Tuesday. Tonight is the launch of season number 3 for our webinar broadcast. I am Bill Brown. I'm the Director of Innovative Evangelism for the Baltimore-Washington Conference. And as we kick off our 3rd season, we kick off with a momentous occasion. And I'd like to welcome our siblings from the Peninsula Delaware Conference as we begin this adventure of joining together on our Training Tuesday platform. And what better way to join together than with our 2 financial experts of both annual conferences. We welcome Paul Eichelberger, our conference treasurer, who has the distinction of being the, I guess, the #1 guest. You've had the most guest spots on our webinar broadcasts. And welcoming Bill Westbrook, the Director of Administrative Services for the Peninsula. Before we get started, I'd just like to always open us up with a word of prayer. So if you all would pray with me, please. Holy and gracious God, from wherever we are gathered, we give you thanks for your Spirit that brings us together as one. We give you thanks for the opportunity to learn from both Bill and Paul as we do the adventure of the ministry of administration through the stewardship of our finances, the gifts that you have provided for the work of ministry in your church. So we pray for your blessing upon our presenters and upon all of our attendees, that you would fill us with your wisdom, your insight, and your understanding. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have a question for our presenters, please use the Q&A feature, and you can find that in the toolbar for your Zoom platform, that, whatever device you are using. So feel free to ask questions, and we'll ask our presenters those questions throughout the evening. You do not need to raise your hand because that will get you nothing, and the chat is only available if you need to speak to me about a technical issue. Other than that, any type of interaction that you would like to have with our presenters, please use the Q&A feature. We have almost 150 of us together tonight, and it will be a wonderful presentation. And with that, Bill and Paul, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. I'm going to start off with just an overview of the Finance Committee itself, and then I'm going to turn it over to Paul to give you some insights and some things you might be looking at come the first of the year or towards the end of this year. So let's start with the Finance Committee itself. The committee has a membership dictated by the Book of Discipline, which consists of the chairperson, who's elected by the Charge Conference, the pastor or pastors if you have more than one appointed, the lay member to annual conference, the chair of the church council or administrative board, the pastor parish relations representative, the board of trustees representative, a chair of stewardship committee if you have one, and if you don't, then the finance committee acts as the stewardship committee as a whole. And then we round it out with the lay leader, treasurer, and financial secretary. I just want to point out the 2 items there, pastor parish relations and board of trustees. When they say reps, it does not have to be the same person that comes to your meeting on a regular basis. It's whoever they wish to represent them at the finance meeting. So it's a little different than some other committees you might be involved with. So your top priority as a finance committee is asset management. Now, what are those assets that you might have? Obviously, it's cash. You have personnel, and that is why you have a representative from Staff Parish Relations Committee on this committee. And you have equipment, property, and possibly endowment funds. And those 3 items are in the purview of the Board of Trustees. So that's why you have a representative of the Board of Trustees on your committee so that you know what the financial impacts of both personnel and the building and occupancy situation. Now, your purpose as a committee is basically threefold. Sounds pretty simple, but it's a lot more in depth. But your first responsibility is in the raising of funds. Then you're involved in the dispersing of those funds. And in between, you're managing those funds to get the best rate of return that you can. Now we'll go to the role of the chairperson, and I'd like to add that this is not just for the Finance Committee. This really is a definition of any chairperson for any committee. And your basic thing is to guide the work of the board or the committee through planning an agenda. Obviously, if you have nothing on the agenda, there's not a reason to meet. Then presiding at the meeting to make sure you stay on topic and stay on the agenda to get things done. But for me, the most important aspect as a chairperson is creating an environment that nurtures the participation of every member on the board and committee. There are no wallflowers allowed in any of our committees. So you need to make sure that everyone is participating and you're making an environment that everyone's input feels safe and it's respected. Then you also need to be knowledgeable about the disciplinary and legal requirements related to your board and committee. Participate in the church council and communicate with your pastor or pastors as necessary about the financial implications for your church. Our next item is the role of the financial secretary. That person's role is all things incoming to the church. So they account for all receipts deposited by the church. They provide an accounting to the treasurer, and then they keep accurate records of contributions by individuals. And the reason they do that is so that they can provide adequate substantiation to contributions for tax purposes. And to give you the 1,000-foot view on what's required for this substantiation, for IRS purposes, it must be in writing for any single contribution of $250 or more, and it must include the date that it transpired and the amount. So you can do it each time someone gives a $250 contribution, or you can hold it to the end of the year and give them a statement with all those contributions, but they must be listed separately and they must have the date associated with it. Also associated with that is it must have a statement that says no goods or services were received in exchange for these contributions. And then it must be signed by a representative of the church. Without those items, an individual, if they try and take a charitable deduction for what they contribute to your church, it most likely would be denied. So it's very important that you maintain that. And I also indicate that I believe it's important, even if the contributions are not 250 or more, that I would recommend that you provide a statement for each individual on an annual basis showing what they contributed and how it was accounted for within your books in order to create a sense of trust that everything that has been provided to the church has been handled in the proper manner. The role of the treasurer. Well, if the financial secretary is all things incoming to the church, the role of the treasurer is all things leaving the church through disbursement of funds. And that should only happen if it's properly authorized by both the budget and another leader within the church. The treasurer should not be signing any checks that have not already been authorized by someone else. And that's a safeguard to make sure that whatever invoices are being paid are accurate, because obviously the treasurer does not order everything for the church, so they would have no idea whether the items were received, whether the items that were received were the ones that were ordered, and whether the pricing is what was actually quoted when they made the order. So the only way the treasurer knows how to determine whether that is accurate is to have the person that actually placed the order authorize the payment of the invoice. Now, one of the questions I usually get at this point would be, well, how do you authorize ongoing bills like monthly bills for telephone, utilities, and items like that? And what you can do is have the Board of Trustees or the Finance Committee look at those types of bills and give the treasurer an authorized blanket authorization to pay particular bills as long as they do not exceed a certain dollar amount. And then that's put on record for the treasurer to have as an authorization. The treasurer is also responsible for the cash management when funds are in the bank that are not needed at the current time, to make sure that they're getting the maximum interest rate available as you can. They're also responsible for tax withholding and reporting to the Social Security Administration and the IRS. And I can't stress this enough, that do not get behind in making your tax deposits, because the IRS does not mess around. Then report to the Committee on the Finance. And I have that specifically as reporting to the Committee on Finance because my experience is many churches have their treasurer also report to the Administrative Council or Board the financial report. But my recommendation would be that it's made to the Finance Committee, and then the chairperson of the Finance Committee would make that presentation to the Administrative Board or Administrative Council. And my rationale for that is that the more people that understand your financial statements and explain them, the better you're going to be, especially if something were to happen to your treasurer, that they became incapacitated for any reason. You would have someone that would be able to understand their statements and move on without skipping a beat. And lastly, the treasurer would handle bank reconciliations. Now, how does the committee manage its church funds? The first and most prominent would be the annual budget. And the annual budget is simply a plan of how the funds to be managed during the year. It is designed to support a vision outlined by the Charge Conference and administered by the Church Council or Administrative Board. How is it used? Primarily as a guide to the ministry of the church for the budgeted year, usually an annual basis. And it should be flexible and not mandated or chiseled in stone. And the reason it needs to be flexible is because it can change when your assumptions change. So if you were to budget and you got to mid-year and your income was 10% ahead of what you budgeted, wouldn't it be nice to be able to put that 10% into mission work within your church? It's used as a communications tool to communicate both with your leadership and with your constituents. It's used, as we just said, with the treasurer as an authorization for expenditures. And at the end of the year, it's used in an evaluation tool to determine how good we were at anticipating our assumptions. Steps to a good budget. As we said earlier, that it's supposed to support your vision. So we start with the vision that is established by your charge conference. If you don't have a vision, then it's going to be difficult to really have an adequate budget. From the vision, then you have goals that extend out 2 to 5 years of what you want to accomplish to get you closer to your vision. But then you further segment these goals into programs that you're going to conduct during the next budgeted period, the 12 months. And that information is provided to your various committees, and they determine how much they're going to need during that budgeted period to accomplish those goals or those programs that they've been assigned. Once they've calculated that information, they would then present that to the Finance Committee, who compiles it and creates your budget. Now, I know this is probably foreign to most churches. When I've done this as an in-person training, I always open it and ask the question, how does your church actually budget? And I would say 99.5% of the time, they would come back and say, well, I look at last year's budget and I say, well, we think this is going to go up by $100. That's going to go up by $100. This might go down a little bit because we didn't spend as much. And that's how they budget. That's kind of from an historical basis. But the budget process I just lined out is one that looks towards the future, not to the past, for how your budget is calculated. If you're using the historical numbers, basically what you're telling yourself and your congregants is that you're going to do exactly the same thing this year that you did last year. And that may or may not be a good thing. So I would encourage you, if you can, to begin to look at the process of starting with your vision and moving into the budget rather than doing the budget and then working to your vision. Other things that you're going to be involved with as a committee is establishing policies and internal controls. And why are you going to do that? Well, as a church leader, you have a responsibility and an obligation to make sure that all the church assets are protected. And what are they protected from? They're protected from human beings, because all the church leaders are human after all, and they can make honest mistakes, transpositions, misspellings, you name it, they can do it. But as human nature, you also have instances where you have dishonest acts. So your internal controls are an attempt to overcome both of these situations. What are those controls? Well, it's anything that can be done, various procedures adopted by the organization in order to safeguard your assets, check the reliability and accuracy of financial records, and ensure compliance with the established policies and also with established law. The internal controls take two forms, and they're pretty straightforward. The first form is preventative, and the second form is detective. And we'll go through each of those briefly. The preventative, obviously, this is so that you're trying to not have these mistakes happen at all. The first is one that I think most people are familiar with, and that's segregation of duties. What that basically means is that no one person handles everything. So if we go back to the example of our financial secretary and our treasurer, the financial secretary does all things receipts, the treasurer does all things disbursements. They are not the same person. They should be two different people, and they should not be related to each other. And that's what we mean by segregation of duties. Second preventative one is creating a collections counting process for your church. Again, this is a situation where you want at least two people counting. And again, those two people should not be related to one another. You can use purchase orders, which means someone has to do some investigating prior to placing an order. One of the examples I could give you would be A lot of times our trustees say, okay, go down to Home Depot or Lowe's and get whatever you need to make that minor repair at the church. And then you come back and you have all this stuff and you're kind of surprised at how much it costs. But what you could do is say, okay, go down to the Lowe's or Home Depot, price out what you think you're going to need and bring it back and let's discuss whether we need it or not. So that would be a use of a purchase order. Similar item would be invoice pre-approvals, where you're getting information from an outside vendor and they're providing an invoice up front before anything, any transaction changes hands. And then also creating an approved vendor list where people can go and these individuals or companies have already been vetted that they are above board and have done work for the church in the past, and they are reasonable in price, and therefore they would have less scrutiny when placing orders. Some of the detective items: independent review of monthly bank statements. One of the things that we tend to do as a finance committee is leave the work to the financial secretary and the treasurer, and we just accept the reports. But I would recommend that someone on the committee, if it's not the chairperson, someone be assigned that they would review the bank statements maybe once or twice a year. The reason you're doing that is, again, as one of the internal controls, is that you have to make sure people are adhering to the policies. So if you have a policy to do monthly bank statements and you're not doing them monthly, how would you know that unless you're investigating and looking at those bank statements? One of the things that I've seen happen in the past is most people don't understand that a bank, you have 60 days to correct any mistakes on the bank statement. After that 60 days, the bank is not required to make any change. So if you're not reconciling those bank statements for 3, 4, 5 months at a time, and you end up having a error, I can guarantee you if the error's in the bank's favor, it's not going to be changed. So it's important that someone is looking at these bank statements other than the treasurer. Similar to that is periodic reviews of selected activity. This is the same reason. Are people following the policies? So you could ask the financial secretary to look at the deposits and the contribution lists for a particular Sunday. Same with the treasurer. You could go and say, okay, I want to see check number 10, 20, 25, and 30, and I want to see all the authorizing documents behind those checks, just to make sure that they're following the policies that you have in place. Use of a transfer schedule would be a situation where a church may have multiple bank accounts for whatever reason. And if they make transfers from one account to another, this would be like an Excel spreadsheet that says, I've withdrawn from one, I've deposited in another. But if you add all those transactions all the way to the end, the amount should be zero. If it's not, then you know cash has left your banking system and you need to find out where it went to. Vendor ranking lists. This is mostly a reliable tool when you're doing computerized statements. And most financials will allow you to say, okay, during this period of time, list the vendors by the total amount of money they received during that time. So if you pull this list and the top of the list is Bill Westbrook, you know you have a problem, because I haven't done any work for most of the churches. So that would tell you that you're paying somebody that's not providing a service to your church. And obviously the last is the annual audit. So I think now we've done a little bit of an oversight of the Finance Committee. Do we have any questions that have cropped up so far?
Of course, we have questions. You
Okay.
first question that comes in is, first, I have to say, I really appreciate when treasurers talk about mission and vision. That is always just a bright spot for me instead of dollars and cents. But somebody asked, what is the difference between vision and mission? Why not use the mission instead of the vision?
The mission is something that's always with you, but the vision is something you want to strive towards, that you're not there yet and you want to get to. The mission is something that drives your vision, but your vision is a little bit broader than just the mission, and it's a more contextual than just the mission. So it's something that you generally would go through a visioning type situation with that mission always in the background, but you're taking that mission and contextualizing it into your community and trying to figure out how you can make that mission possible in your vision.
Excellent, thank you.
I think
Go ahead, Paul.
I think that vision actually helps you understand how you're going to accomplish your mission. So the vision is different. I think the vision can change between churches, between communities, depending on exactly what your community says, and your missions might be very much the same at the end of the day, but your visions can be very drastically different.
And I would add to that, your vision is where God is calling your congregation to go. Your mission is how you're going to get there. And simply put, I think we all do have the same mission. I think the United Methodist Church puts it wonderfully that our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. But your vision is, what's the picture of how that's going to look like in your community that God's called you to enact? A couple other, just first, because we have some of the best participants in any webinars, they point things out for me that I have forgotten to say. I did forget to say that all of our slides and a copy of the video will be available later this week, posted to the various conference websites. So don't worry if you get a little behind, you will be able to access the slides and the video later on. So Bill, one question that comes in, are budgets fiscal year or calendar year?
That would be up to your local church to decide how you want to do that. It can be either fiscal or calendar. Some churches feel that the calendar year they don't like the fact that December tends to be a high income month, and they don't want to wait till the end of their budgeted period to determine what their income is. So they may go to a different fiscal year. I've seen some that are July 1 through June 30th to correspond with an appointment year. So it can be either one. Just remember, if you do it on a fiscal year, when you do the statistical reports, you will have to convert that to a calendar year basis. So the statistical reports are on a calendar year basis.
And does the committee have to be bonded?
The committee itself does not have to be bonded, but anybody that's handling the cash should be part of a bond.
Okay.
And that can be accomplished through your insurance carrier.
And who is responsible for carrying out the annual audit? Is that a member of the committee, a member of the church, or outside auditors?
That again can be either. The discipline does allow that to take place within the church itself. So you could have one individual, you could create an audit committee. And the General Counsel on Finance and Administration does put out a good resource called the Local Church Audit Guide that I would recommend that you download. And it actually is a step-by-step process on how to conduct that audit for your local church. The only requirement is either the person or the committee cannot be associated with the finance committee. It has to be independent of the finance committee. That's the only requirement.
Okay. Now there's a couple part question. one of our participants was surprised that you did not mention any at-large members on the Finance Committee. Their particular congregation has at-large members on a 3-year rotation basis, in addition to the people you've listed. So if you do have, should you have at-large members? And if you do, what is their role?
That would be totally up to the local church. What I've provided to you is the disciplinary requirements. Those would be the voting members of it. I don't know that if you have at-large members by discipline, whether they would be voting members or ex officio without vote on the committee. That I'd have to investigate with our chancellor to determine whether they have that right to do it as a local church. But it would be whatever purpose they would have for these individuals on the Finance Committee. If they believe there needs to be additional expertise on the committee for any reason outside of those that are already serving, certainly they can be asked to attend. But whether they have vote is another question.
And some practical questions. Can the finance chairperson be a counter?
Yes, there's no reason why they couldn't be a counter.
And we're gonna take that a step further with a different person saying that they're in a small church with a lot of interconnected family, which makes it difficult to separate out duties. Not saying that it's happening. Hypothetically, what do you do if hypothetically you can't always separate out duties because of the interconnectedness of the congregation?
Believe it or not, that usually comes up with every session that I have.
Okay, I believe it.
And I'll expand on the segregation duties conversation a little bit more. The fact we think of that as blood relatives, brothers, sisters, husband, wife, that kind of situation. But I would contend you have to understand the rationale for why it's in place. And it's basically because you don't want to put a person in a situation where they have to call out someone that they have a real close personal relationship with. So I would expand that to say, if you're in a small church and you have a brother and sister that are always at each other's throats, they would be the perfect persons to have in those two roles. But if you have two friends that are like brothers or like sisters, that would also be a situation where I would call into question whether they should be working together, because it could destroy that friendship if somebody's not doing the right thing and you have to call them out on it.
Okay.
But I would also then say that in that particular situation, if you can't legitimately provide for segregation of duties, that you'd want to make sure those extra internal controls where you're looking at the bank statements on a regular basis, doing the periodic reviews of the deposit and the checks, that becomes even more important in a situation where you have segregation of duties that's not as strict.
Now, a couple of questions around counting. How or when should the deposit? When do the deposits have to be made after receiving an offering?
The best recommendation is immediately following the service, if you have that capacity. If you don't, then you have to have the extra step of making sure that the deposit is safe and secure someplace. I would not recommend that it go home with anybody and then deposited the next day. It would need to stay in the office in a secure location, hopefully a safe or some kind of a fireproof box, and then it could be taken to the bank the next business day.
Okay, and I'm glad you reiterated not to take the money home to count. I know I've served some appointments that hypothetically that may have happened.
Right.
And And finally, before we move on, you said something that I just thought bore repeating. You said one of the number one roles of the finance committee is raising funds. And I noticed you didn't say that their number one role was to control the purse strings.
Correct. Well, that's actually a budgetary question.
Okay.
I normally get the question, who controls the budget?
Okay, who controls the budget?
And in the scenario that I presented, where you have the programs providing information to the finance committee to create the budget, the finance committee's role is to collect the data to present a budget, but the actual authority rests with the administrative council or church council to present that to the charge conference. So it's really the administrative council that controls the purse strings. And the reason for that is because that is the only place where all the programmatic side of your church has a voice. They're not part of the finance committee. None of the program agencies are part of your finance committee. So if you're trying to prioritize in your budget, how can you do that without the program committees being able to provide input? So that role lies with the administrative board or church council. The finance committee is only a recommending body. It is not an authoritarian body.
Okay, we have a number of people who are asking questions in our chat, and I would ask them to please use the Q&A. This time I will be a little more lenient. Should two persons be making the deposit at the bank, or can one person do that?
If it's a secure bag, it can be one person.
Okay. And one other person asked that the counters prepare an income summary sheet for the treasurer to record in QuickBooks. The treasurer also processes check requests. Can the treasurer also use the giving envelopes as a way to confirm the summary sheet that they're recording the giving into the proper account? So can they use
the treasurer
that documentation?
Well, there should be a summary sheet that's provided to the treasurer on the deposit showing, the various categories of receipts so that they can record it on the books. But the envelopes themselves, that should be the purview of the financial secretary, and that would be part of that review process of making sure that those are recorded appropriately by individual, and they relate back to that summary sheet that was provided to the treasurer. But the treasurer should not be doing that.
Okay, and one final question before we
then
move
they get
on.
looked, and
Oh,
then
go
they get
ahead,
looked at,
Paul.
Bill. They get sampled during the audit, so that's how you get a cross check on those matching up, and the sampling will be enough to do an audit on it.
So
Right.
what I hear you both saying is keep the giving envelopes.
At least for a year, yes,
1 year.
absolutely.
And a follow-up question on the at-large members, and some of our participant just wants to say, to be clear, the at-large members are approved or elected at charge conference, and they are the quote doers on the committee with all the extra things that need to be done by the committee, giving analytics, some of the communication strategy, input processes and procedure writing, etc. So with that clarity, I think we can move on. We'll have some other questions we can get to after a bit. So gentlemen, carry on.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Bill. For those who don't know, Bill Westbrook and I overlap in a lot of things that we do. So we serve in the Northeast jurisdiction together. We see each other through those types of activities. We also serve on the foundation, Mid-Atlantic Foundation, together. We sit on that board together. So we have a lot of opportunities to cross paths. And then we've been working together for a number of years as well. So Bill's the old hand at doing all this. And I'm in my 12th year, Bill. How many years have you got?
26.
26. So I'm trying to catch you in all of this. This is the first time that we've had a chance to team teach this. I value it greatly. I really like being able to hear hear the different ways of going about this. But I think, Bill, you and I realized that when we compared our notes on what a Finance 101 presentation looks like, I think I actually started by stealing yours initially 12 years ago. So it's very, very good to be able to do this together. And I thank you for the opportunity to co-teach this. The things that I wanted to go through is kind of just echo, why are we doing this in November? And it's really to get ready. We'd like you to be able to use this presentation to create wish lists and goals and objectives for your 2022 working in the Finance Committee. So a lot of what Bill's already gone over is going to be on your wish list to implement improved governance, reporting, and controls on your committee. I really liked some of the things that Bill brought up. It's, it could be as easy as just watching the environment that your chair is creating to allow everybody on the committee to participate, making sure that everybody has a voice on the committee. I believe it's also the audits, it's the budget, it's going back to your basic vision for the church. All these are very good fundamentals for you to just kind of think about what are the highlights of what you want to do in 22. And beyond the list of what Bill's already presented, I would just bring a couple other projects that you might be in that place at your church to consider now. Perhaps one of them could be upgrading the church accounting software, church management software, online giving options. A lot of churches have taken that on during the COVID. And then I want to be able to also include in tonight's presentation just a reiteration of what many churches are working through who have lay employees, and that's the retention or the employee retention credit. I did skip over the retention of church records. We'll have a little slide on that as well. So these are going to be the highlights of what we use for closing out our presentation tonight, and then we'll open it up back up for questions after this. Bill, the first one that I have is with the upgrading of church accounting software. I'm really not going to give you the answer tonight, but if you're looking to do some comparison of different accounting softwares for churches, I'd ask you to take a picture of this screen and capture this URL at the top. Capterra is a good website that I have found of great use for being able to compare what is in the industry. This is really a developing area. A lot of online packages are now available for church accounting software. They have different mixes of product. Some come strictly with the accounting software. Some of them come with mixes of management and accounting. So it's really, this one stop allows you to do some comparisons between the different types of options that you have. One of the things that they've added recently has been a matrix. So I showed this on this screen to be able to show they kind of put you in quadrants. And some of these are key players that we've known for, Bill and I both know churches who are using church Windows, ACS. Tithely is up here. That's kind of a newcomer to this sphere. Promise Keepers, Servant Keepers is on this list as well. And QuickBooks, Shelby, these are all areas that the church, Bill and I are familiar with churches that have these packages. I would end this conversation with the accounting software and just knowing that QuickBooks still offers a very good solution for many churches. Simplified startup, many have gone to the online package. Online workings of a financial accounting system allows volunteer treasurers and such to be able to do it remotely, be able to do a lot of their activity possibly while they're sitting in their work office, sitting at home and not necessarily tied to a desktop that's sitting at the church. QuickBooks is one. Church Windows, GCFA has a relationship with Church Windows and has done some work with them in the past to be able to help develop that product for local churches. And I did mention here the cloud-based systems having some conveniences and advantages. So we'll go to the church management software next. This Capterra website handles all types of church software. So when you ask for a church management software, all you have to do is kind of do a different sort. And on this screen, I'll show you some of the capabilities that they have inside of Capterra, where they actually can ask you, let's do a comparison. Let's do a comparison on this example of Tithely and Church Windows. And they'll give you the comparison for pricing, what it's best used for, features, comparison of the features. They'll have reviews by users that have been collected on these two platforms, pros and cons associated with each platform. And then it gives you, actually, I love it because it just gives you the ability to drill into the actual details, gives you your website for Tithely in this case, website for Church Windows, and you just keep drilling into it till you get the answers that you're looking for to be able to do a good side-by-side comparison. So Capterra, highly recommend those. There are many other resources for doing this, but this is a nice first stop perhaps in your search to understand what kind of considerations you might have. Like I said, it's always changing. So there's been several new products. If you haven't done this for 5 years, you might have your eyes opened by what types of products are out there now. Many vendors I mentioned before include church accounting and management features in the same package. Online giving features can also be compared on this website. Some of the ones that we're familiar with through GCFA or Vanco for the online giving, and Servant Keepers for some of the software that keeps track of individual giving and making those statements for your parishioners. Then we'll go to the next. Have a simple slide on where you go to address what the retention records are for your church records. So if you've not done this, this is with the General Commission on Archives and History. The website is up on the top. It links you to, it's a pretty detailed document, about 20 pages or so. And I've highlighted some of the examples. This might be an area for your committee to think of improving what your retention of records are. Maybe you're keeping too many, maybe you're not keeping them long enough. Some of these really echo in the recent discussions with churches, keeping permanent. Some of the things that you would want to have permanently, and it actually identifies whether you keep these at the church property or whether you try to find a long-term storage facility for some of these records. But nonetheless, they're just looking for the safety of these types of permanent records. Things like audit records, annual budgets, property files, tax exempt certificates, bequests, insurance policies. Insurance policies have definitely been in the news as we've been working with churches over the last 6 or so months. For those things that are kept in 7 years, accounts payable, receivable, bank statements, personnel records, tax withholdings, 6 years, contracts for repairs, lease and loan agreements, pay records kept for 5 years, surface contracts 4 years, deposit slips and timesheets 3 years. And we kind of mentioned this, offering envelopes, any of the records for the actual giving envelopes, things like that, 1 year. 1 year is what's recommended for that. And Bill, how did I go into this? So this is the reminder slide that we've got, and there might be some additional questions. We're certainly here to be able to field those perhaps for the employee retention credits. This might be new for you, but this is a credit that's been offered through the COVID relief. Various levels of COVID relief have contained this employee retention credit. Let me give you some of the basics. It's available for any churches with lay employees where the church pays the payroll taxes, that's the Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes, and submits these quarterly on a Form 941 to the IRS. And there was at one time in 2020 when if you were to receive PPP funds, you were no longer eligible to be able to obtain this employee retention credit. But that was subsequently changed, and in 2021, provisions were made that even if you had PPP funds, you were able to provide at least a portion of the employee retention credit that's available. Once again, it's important to realize that this does not impact clergy pay. So you need to have lay employees and you need to be reporting things on 941s. It's actually the 941 reports where the credit is claimed. Let's go through two aspects of it. and we'll keep this fairly simple for this presentation. And then we'll do follow-up. If people have questions that go into a lot of detail, finance offices are always available for being able to answer these types of questions. But let's just go through the basic eligibility on whether a church can apply for an employee retention credit. There are two eligibility requirements. One is called the shutdown test. The other one is a gross receipts test. And in the shutdown test, every church that was impacted by a governor's ruling that shut down or limited the ability for churches to gather is able to claim during the time frame in which that order was in place qualification eligibility for the ERC through this shutdown test. So it says here, any employer that had to fully or partially suspend operations due to orders from an appropriate governmental authority due to the coronavirus disease, that's what's in the statute, you qualify. For our areas, for both Bill's and my area, we need to kind of look within each one of the state governances or district governance to understand how that's played out over the last couple of years. In Maryland, they had a statute, I believe the last it was 50% levels of participation, 50% of what the sanctuary could hold. And that provision was rescinded in March 12th, 2021, earlier this year. And so that when you apply that for the shutdown test, that means that churches in Maryland are able to qualify for the shutdown test for the entire course of 2020 and also the first quarter of 2021. The same applies for DC, where they had the courts actually reversed a DC order on March 25th of 2021. So they also get that qualification of just the first quarter in 2021 and all of 2020. When you look at Delaware, Delaware was a little bit later when they rescinded in May. So that actually opens up the second quarter for churches in Delaware to apply for the ERC. And unfortunately, when we look at the West Virginia, at least from the standpoint of the ERC, because they had a declaration that religious services were deemed as essential, they never went through the shutdown or limiting factor of a government ruling to limit their worship services. So they do not qualify under that provision of the shutdown test for the ERC. So churches that did not qualify under the shutdown test would then look at their gross receipts. And it's simply a comparison of 2020 and 2021 gross receipts to what they received in the similar quarter, the same quarter in 2019. There's a little bit of nuances in this, but nonetheless, they're looking for a large drop in gross receipts, 50% reduction in gross receipts during the course of 2020. And in 2021, it was a 20% drop. So it became easier in 2021 to be able to claim the ERC. And it also changed the view that what they were looking at in 2020 was a total year's worth of gross receipts. And in 2021, things started to look more like a quarter to quarter comparison. And the actual dollar amounts that are being received by ERCs are greater in 2021 because of that view. We have two resources on this slide that offer good support on this. I think we can see the Westpath clearly on this, and it looks to me like my version is cutting off at the very bottom. Bill, is yours also cutting off there?
Yes, it looks that way to me.
It was
on the screen.
It was a video. It was a YouTube video that's at the bottom of that. So we'll have these slides posted and people will be able to see the additional resources there for the ERC. We'll see if any questions get asked about that. And Bill, I think I have one last slide before we go to the complete Q&A. I like advertising this when I do presentations with finance committees and treasurers throughout the conference. And this has been a helpful book from a conference perspective, conference treasurer perspective. And I also think that it really helps a local church to really know the ins and outs of church finances. So it's Richard Hammer's book. Richard Hammer is a legal and CPA expert in church finances. This book is a good 2-inch thick book that gives you a lot of detail. This is where you can find a lot of case studies on where churches have run into trouble if they're, for instance, what Bill said about churches not making proper payments for their payroll taxes, keeping those up with the IRS and Social Security Administration. This is where you find out a little bit more detail about the dual tax status of clergy, as they are self-employed for practical purposes with Social Security, but for income tax purposes, both state and federal, they are more of an employee rather than self-employed. This is a good book for understanding accountable reimbursement plans and what are the details about following each of those guidelines associated with how you reimburse a pastor for their expenses. So that's just a little bit of a highlight of those types of things that can be found in this. It's up to $60, Bill, for this book. So we'll count this as part of the inflationary pressure. I think 2 years ago, this book was about $50. But that's a very nice gift for somebody that if you know they're a treasurer and they would value that, that might be a very nice way for a congregation to recognize the efforts of their local church treasurer. Bill, I think that's my last slide. Let me confirm that with you. Well, I appreciate the chance to present that, and Bill will open it up to see if there are any questions as we.
All righty. Well, I would ask if we could stop sharing screen and then we can see everybody nice and clearly. And you have spurred lots of questions, Paul.
I brought Bill along with me for the ride.
Well, let's get some simple ones out of the way.
Fair enough.
Who's responsible for completing the statistical report?
Who's responsible?
Multiple
Bill,
people.
My experience is it's really up to the local congregation to determine that. A lot of pastors actually like to have their fingers on it and coordinate the data so that they have a firsthand knowledge of everything that's being reported. But it's up to the local church. Bill?
If you want to have a down and dirty explanation, I would say table 1 would be your membership secretary at your church, because it's all about the numbers of people. Table 2 would primarily be your treasurer with some input from the board of trustees in terms of asset values. And then table 3 would primarily be your financial secretary.
Yep. And I know a lot of treasurers who will be the coordinator for a lot of that activity. The majority of it becomes a financial exercise with support by other folks.
Should the financial secretary be a paid position?
Sounds like it was asked by a financial secretary.
That's funny. It was not. I won't say who, but it was not.
For me, it would depend on the size of the church and the graciousness of whether you have somebody that would volunteer to do it. But outside of that, if you're a large church, it's probably something that you're going to have a paid person do, just for time purposes.
If you're making a change, it certainly pays to announce, get the vision of having paid positions handling the books, but this goes for the treasurer as well. But I believe that it helps in the transition. If you're unpaid today and you're going to a paid position, allow 2 or 3 years in that transition to understand what that means to build it into the budget.
Now, you might have covered this with the book you recommended. Will that book help churches keep up with the IRS changes and requirements and with state tax and reporting requirements? And if not, what resources can you recommend to help a church with that?
Well, you can actually go out to the IRS, and each of the states in their finance offices generally have e-news that you can sign up for. And when there are significant changes, they'll send you an e-newsletter about it. So I would recommend going to your state finance office and also going to the IRS and signing up for newsletters to get that kind of information.
Mhm.
And generally, if it's a very important change, I think we as the conference treasurers would probably give some inclination of what has to happen on that change.
It is. Changes don't come by every year. That's the other thing. A lot of these things stay the same year over year. I will mention that Richard Hammer's book does do a very good, it's published every year. So they do a good section in the front that highlights the changes year over year, so that if you're used to looking into this manual, you'll be greatly aided by what's changed by just looking at the very front of it.
Now, you mentioned Capterra, Paul.
Mhm.
And I'm looking at one of our attendees also recommended, and I've used it before, the website TechSoup.
TechSoup is a good software, low-cost, nonprofit website for picking up. I'm not sure about the shopping for it. Bill, what's been your experience for shopping at TechSoup?
Well, I'm not sure that they do the comparison that you showed in Capterra, but you can use the Capterra to look at and decide what you want, and then TechSoup sells it at a discount.
Yep. See it the same way.
That would be a good idea. Now, Paul, somebody asked, assume that your 941 ERC was approved by the IRS. What happens with approval? Does the IRS send you a check? What are the next steps?
Yeah, you actually get to determine that you can either get a, so let's assume that you're doing a 941 and your actual obligation, the numbers are kind of strange. You wouldn't think this would happen, but let's say that your obligation for that quarter was, we'll keep it round numbers, $1,000 that you were supposed to submit. And you did this ERC credit. And because the ERC credit is actually based on salaries associated with folks, and then a percentage of that salary, you could actually get a credit that quarter for, let's say, $3,000. You get at the end of the 941, and you could either do this on the actual real-time 941 that you're submitting, or you do this as a retroactive. If you're trying to do a quarter from the past, you'll do this on a 941X form. You'll be able to identify that either you want this $2,000 in this case that was surplus. You can either ask for that to be a check today written to you, or you can ask that just to be a credit for the future, that you'll continue to gather and pay off future 941 obligations by that credit.
And how long should a congregation wait to receive their ERC?
So they've asked for the check. So I just simply know that a lot of things have been very slow, especially if it's money coming back out. So unfortunately, I have a personal experience of doing an amended past year tax return. 12 months. Once it's filed. So I would not expect it to, if you're waiting, I don't think that you've waited long enough. Don't raise any bells and whistles yet. But find a number where you can call for checking up on it. That's probably all you need to do at this point.
Okay. Now, in determining the gross receipts test, would receipts attributed to a preschool be included, or is it strictly for church receipts, giving and fundraising that should be used?
It's an entity issue. Bill, do you see it the same way? So it's
Well,
the 941
say
entity is submitted.
Yeah, I would say if the preschool was part of the 941, then the receipts would have to be included. Absolutely.
That's how I see it. So it's really tied to the 941 disclosures that you're making.
If it's a separate corporation and run separately from the church, then they would have to do their own ERC, and the church would have its own, because the employees would be under two different EIN numbers.
Yeah. But probably a little bit more common to have this all grouped together is probably more likely the case.
So would you say the easy test would be the employee identification number that's being used? If it's the
It really
same?
is how you're filing the 941 bill.
Okay,
I think that's probably the easier one to say there. I could probably come up with some examples of somebody having a separate EIN, but still filing under the church EIN.
got it. Now, can a church apply both eligibility criteria at different parts of the covered period?
Both eligibility. So I qualify both on the, what do we call that test?
Shutdown test.
Shutdown test, and also in the gross receipts test.
Yes.
I think you get the option that if you're shut down, that's the first priority. Yep, that's easy. And then you go to the secondary one being your gross receipts secondarily, and allow that to continue as many quarters as you can gain through that gross receipts test. Do you hear anything else in that, Bill?
No, I would say that they could qualify under both at different times.
At different times, yeah.
At different
Each quarter
times,
could be
yeah.
a different qualification. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. And who receives those funds? Is it the church or is it the employee?
Oh, definitely the church.
The church.
Okay.
Church is the one making the obligation payments.
Yeah, it's actually designed for the employer, and it's only for the employer's portion that they would pay. It's not for the amount that's withheld from the individual's pay that's being reimbursed.
Very, very good point. So this is likened to the PPP funds where you're essentially allowing the church to obtain funds for keeping people on employment, keeping them, and this is just a different source. So the PPP was coming through the Small Business Administration. This set of funds from the ERC is coming in through the Social Security Administration.
Okay, I think that's all of our ERC questions. So we'll get into all of the other random ones. Can the pastor or any member of the church ask to see the monthly bank statements?
Monthly bank statements.
Well, from my perspective, a nonprofit organization, by law, their books have to be open. So from my perspective, anybody can look at the bank statement.
And now how does that relate? Go ahead, Paul, you look like you were.
No, I was just going to comment that I've never had that question before. So so I appreciate Bill's view on that. I think that's a great way to consider that. You know, the question that I normally get is the pastor's knowledge of individual giving. And so I'm all prepared to answer that one. But you know, looking at the church bank account is even less information in that. I feel no sensitivity to anybody looking at that bank statement.
So Paul, you brought it up. Should the pastor be able to see what individuals give?
Well, we're kind of schooled that that's an appropriate measure of one's faith journey and making of disciples. So I've always been guided that a pastor might choose to do otherwise, and I think that might be more of the legacy of the church or just the custom of the church and what's traditional. But I would never argue with the fact that a pastor has the right and ability to do that. I believe the Book of Discipline was actually changed to formally recognize that, Bill. Do you recall the same?
Not sure on the Book of Discipline, but I'm with you that it's a measure of spirituality. And if something changes in a person's giving and the pastor doesn't know about it, then they don't know that there's a spiritual problem.
Yeah.
Now, what are the roles of 1099 forms? And is there a central list of all accounts that need 2 signatures?
2 separate questions?
I'll take the 2 signature one.
2 separate questions asked by the same person.
What was the
Okay.
1099 question, Bill? One more time.
All they've asked is someone going to cover 1099 forms?
Oh,
Well, one thing about the 1099s is there's always this because of the dual relationship on taxes by the pastor, what should they get, a 1099 or a W-2? The IRS has settled that, and they definitely get a W-2, even though they're still treated for Social Security and Medicare tax as a self-employed individual. They must receive a W-2. Now, if they do separate weddings and funeral services and that kind of thing as a separate payment, then they could receive 1099s for those. But generally, they would get a W-2. And last year, the IRS changed the 1099 forms and split them in two. So you have like an independent contractor is one, and then you have a separate one for other things such as scholarships and other forms of payments like that. So
Like insurance payments and things.
right. So I'm not as schooled on those two changes myself.
The other one, 600 limit on the 1099s is typical. It's a little bit based on the type of payment that's being made and recorded, but 600 is most common for a church threshold. What was the other one? The two signatures?
Should there be a central list of accounts needing two signatures?
You know, the way I come at this one, Bill, is that this is your church policies that you adopt at the finance committee. So this is really the homework of the finance committee on what they think is going to be the proper level for two signatures. I guide churches that say for a conference check, anything over 5,000, we do two signatures on, and that's our protocol.
Well, the difficulty is that it was instituted a long time ago as a way of having an internal control that the bank would monitor. The banks no longer monitor that.
Yeah, that's not, yeah.
So a two signature on a check is meaningless when it comes to internal controls, unless you feel good about it at a local church level. If you're relying on the bank to not process anything that doesn't have two signatures on it, you're going to be waiting a long time.
Sounds good.
And if a staff member is a contractor, what's the obligation of the church in relation to taxes?
There's no withholdings on a contractor payment. 1099 gets reported at the total of the compensation paid. And that's part of your overall contract with the employee, that the contractor has to be worried about their payment. That might be a quarterly statement that they submit each year or each quarter to keep their finances, that's both the state and federal and Social Security payments up to date.
Yeah, the only problem that you have to be worried about is when you use the word staff and contractor in the same sentence, that would open up a can of worms for the IRS.
Yep.
Because you can still be a contractor, but if the church controls every aspect of what you do, then the IRS is probably going to declare that an employer-employee relationship, no matter what you call it. So you have to be concerned about how much control you provide over how that contractor works.
IRS has forms that you can fill out that help guide you to determine that control and whether it's an employee or a contractor that you're hiring.
Okay, now we're going to go back to your earlier statement, Paul. Someone's asking, I guess, since if a pastor can see the church members giving, can the finance committee see the pastor's giving?
Certainly the financial secretary does.
Yeah, the financial secretary is in a privileged role in the church, and you'd want to honor the financial secretary's role here. I believe that that's a conversation for SPRCs and the pastors. That's an open conversation. That's not a checking up on type of conversation. That's a holistic type of thing that many pastors that I'm aware of will use the SPRC as being their modeling discussion to show what they're doing and tell what they're doing. But that's not an obligation by any means. That's probably more discipleship making than anything else.
And what role does the pastor play in the finance committee?
It's one of your list, right, Bill? Mandatory.
Well, they serve on the committee, but their role is basically one of making sure that the conversation stays on a spiritual helm, and that they're concentrating on the mission and ministry of the church and not straying from that. And it helps with the pastor being just knowledgeable about the financial situation of his church, his or her church.
Yep. I've oftentimes asked committees that really need to change the environment of their finance committee to consider an at-large position where somebody's just a prayer warrior. It's known for being a prayer warrior in their church, and to come on a finance committee just for that role is to make sure that everything's not just about the numbers, but it's about the vision and the ministry that they're serving. I think that the best finance committees are the ones that are low key and kind of just right below the surface. They're doing a lot of work, keeping things stable, but the ministry and vision is the real focus of a church.
And do local churches have to file Form 990s?
Religious
No.
organizations are exempt from a 990.
Okay.
If they're with other nonprofits, they would know the world of 990 submittals.
Now, if they engage in any kind of similar for-profit agency, like a church might have a bookstore or a public cafe that they run, the proceeds from that would have to be filed under a 990T for unrelated business tax. But for the most part, 990 is not required.
990T, we used to do a 990T for a Zumba class. It's $1,000 threshold for a 990T. So some churches might get into that. CPAs can really guide a church well through that type of discussion.
Okay, now we had talked about the pastor seeing members giving, members seeing pastors giving. Should the finance committee be reviewing the giving of members in the congregation?
Financial secretary. It's a trusted agent. You really want that to be that's not a common discussion. That's just everybody's business. Allow the financial secretary to be that trusted agent for the church. A good, somebody serving in that role for a good long time is really a value to a church, especially a small church. Allow that transparency and non-disclosure to be part of your culture.
Thank you. Now, for churches where church members aren't lining up to look at bank statements and profit and loss reports, how often should the finance committee give a report to the congregation about the financial status of the church?
I think it depends. Boy, if you're in a building campaign, I've been in those scenarios where you really do want to give updates every other week, that type of thing, on how things are going. So it's an activity based. Hopefully, a lot of this, it goes back to my original comment, I think, Bill, is that you'd like the finance committee to be kind of underlying everything, and the main things getting announced in service and brought out is the ministry and lives impacted and lives changed. Yeah,
when I had talked about the budget, I didn't want to get into the differences between a line item budget and a narrative programmatic budget. Mm-hmm. But if you're just doing an overview of receipts and expenditures for the month, that really doesn't say a lot to a local congregation, especially if you're doing it weekly, and especially if you're finding it the 11 months out of the year, the expenses are exceeding the income until you hit the 12th month, and then everything comes into balance. That's not a good communications. What you need to communicate is how these budgeted dollars are relating to mission, worship, ministry, and the activities of your church, and then what changes they've made in people's lives. That's what drives a budget, not whether you're keeping the lights on or not.
I would add, from a pastoral perspective, the practice I had gotten into while serving local churches was every Sunday, we would have a statement or a story of how lives were being changed because of the offering.
Because of the offering.
Because of the offering, because of people's giving, this is the impact this church was able to have.
I once had a similar conversation, Bill, where a church trustee, a church treasurer, church finance chair standing up and giving a testimony other than numbers is quite effective, and as effective as a pastor who's also able to talk about the finances of the church well. So I think they're complementary of each other, that you step out of your universe and take on a different role every once in a while.
Now, some other practical questions in our remaining time. Can the United Methodist Men apply for their own tax ID number? And if so, would they still be included in the church audit? I guess the broader question is, who can have their own accounts in a local church?
United Methodist Men was the question. Is that right, Bill?
Yes.
I'm going to allow Bill to answer first.
Well, I'll answer that on the second part of that question, that generally our understanding is that the United Methodist Women are the only ones that can have their own separate account, because they are a separate organization at the national level as well. The United Methodist Men are not. So they generally tend to have their own bank account, but they should be reported as part of the church financial report.
It actually, the United Methodist Women also go into how their tax ID is generated from the conference, is how I understand that, Bill. These are things that I like to touch before really discussing too greatly. But I recently touched this on Monday, yesterday. So I understand the United Methodist Women tax ID comes from the conference. That's how you can open up your bank account with and it's not the conference's tax ID, it's the conference's United Methodist Women.
Correct.
Tax ID. So the conference United Methodist Women is responsible for distributing that to the local units, and that allows them to open up their bank accounts. United Methodist Men, like Bill said, do not have that same stipulation and statutes. I don't believe they pursue their own tax ID, Bill, as a result.
I've not seen one.
Yeah, so I've helped them open up a bank account, but it's using the church's tax ID. It's all included as part of the audit. Trustee funds, United Methodist Men funds, anything with the church ID has the same fund audit.
Now, a couple of people have asked, you talked about your vision budgets, but what do you do when your pastor's expense and your mission shares are the largest percentage of your budget, over 2/3 of the budget? How do you approach handling that? Or as one other person was asked about, just due to COVID and the number of people have lost, is there any type of financial strategic planning that can be done to help a church determine affordability?
For the mission shares statements?
Mostly for overall budgets, if they take into consideration how much their staffing costs are, how much their mission shares or their apportionments are, the results of COVID and the reduced number of people participating perhaps in their church. Is there any type of strategic plan to help a church determine what they can afford?
Well, that's something we've addressed with our cabinet in Peninsula Delaware Conference, and we've set some parameters that, generally speaking, if you're paying more than 65% of your budget on your pastoral compensation packages, that you should be in dialogue with your district superintendent about determining what level of pastoral appointment your church needs going forward.
Yeah, I have the same thumb rule. 55 to 60 is a typical range that, and Bill, when you say pastoral compensation for a larger church with multiple staff, you might throw all staffing costs into that 55 to 60 as far as your ministry plan.
Correct.
Yep. Mission shares typically in the 10 to, it depends on what things are being done in ministry and giving outside of the mission share. So 10 to 20% is a typical range. When I look at that from a conference aggregate number, it's 11% is the number for aggregating all churches and what percentage mission shares are of their typical budget income for the year.
Can bequests be used for operational expenses?
Bequests,
Bequests.
it would depend on what restrictions were made at the time of the bequest.
Yep. Unrestricted.
If there were no restrictions, it can be used for anything.
Yep. See it the same way.
Now, we do have a few questions that are really,
Well,
go ahead.
but I would also do this. I think we're always challenged, Bill, even when a conference gets a bequest, it's found money. It's not counted on. I think it's a terrible use of a bequest to put into operational costs, because operational costs, you should have already done the calculation on what you can afford based on your regular income. So it's very special for a bequest to have that special place in a congregation to do something that may not have ever been done had that person not identified the church for receiving it.
And I would go a step farther than that to say that, I'll give you a personal example. In my local church, I had a longtime treasurer who challenged the finance committee to come up with endowment policy before she would give a legacy gift to the church.
Yeah.
Well, she died suddenly. And guess who did not get a legacy? Because they did not have an endowment policy. So I would suggest that if this is the first time you're getting a bequest, that you might want to consider developing an endowment and gift acceptance policy for your church, that you can tell people this is how it will be used going forward, even if there's no strings attached with it when it comes to us.
Yep.
And I think last but not least, is the pastor's reimbursement a part of the pastor's salary package? And if so, why?
Well, I'll make one statement, Bill. So it's part of the pastor's compensation approved at charge conference. What else would you like to add to that statement?
Well, and I'm assuming we're talking about accountable reimbursement.
If it's an accountable reimbursement, then it's not on the W-2.
Correct. So technically it's not salary.
Mhm.
So it has to be accounted for separately as that accountable reimbursement program. But if you broaden the total to be compensation and not saying compensation is salary, but salary is a portion of compensation, then it would be included as compensation.
Is it safe to say it's one of the additional benefits for the
Yes.
clergy person?
So it's the full cost package that you're hiring for the pastor. So the group's mainly interested in that. Finance, of course. SPRC is going to want to know what the full cost is of what you're hiring and what's being positioned for pulpit coverage. And of course, the pastor is very interested in the total.
Now, we do have a couple of questions that are really church specific.
Bill, I might just add, because it's accountable reimbursement, those expenses are only incurred by the pastor because of the work that they do.
That is correct.
So very
Right.
common in the workplace for the employer to pay for those types of costs connected directly with the business.
Right.
How can people reach you? Because there's some specific questions that some people have specific questions for their particular context and need to talk to somebody beyond a general question. So what is the best way to reach either of you?
I was thinking, Bill, during your presentation, as you're going through the slides of just Finance 101, these are the types of questions that Bill and I get every day. So feel free, this is why we're here. We're a great resource. Give us a call if If we can't answer it, then we'll find the answer for you and get back to you.
Yeah, I think for me, the most convenient would be to email.
Yeah. I really like email because it allows me to document the answer, and it allows you to then share that appropriately with the other folks in the congregation who will want to hear it.
And I know you can find your email addresses on either conference websites. So
Correct.
bwcumc.org or pen-del.org, if I get that correct.
Correct.
So please look for those. And someone is asking for a shameless plug. Can you make your endowment and gift policy available, Bill Westbrook, so people can shamelessly steal it?
Well, I can do better than that. I'll get the one that's out of the Mid-Atlantic Foundation.
That's where we go. They've got the best templates for folks.
And last but not, well, first of all, thank you very much, gentlemen. This is the time I will open up the chat. People can go to the chat since they can't applaud where we can hear. If you go to the chat and just put in your thanks to Paul and Bill so that they can see it, that would be good. And you gentlemen have some great thank yous in the chat. So it is wonderful.
Thank you,
that
everyone.
everyone was able to participate and join us tonight. Thank you both so much for taking the time out to cover a very important topic in the life of the local church. And for everyone else, thank you very much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. And I will see you all next week. Bye now.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.